Let me start by asking you a simple but urgent question. What happens when a small, impoverished nation, long underestimated by global powers, suddenly unleashes 1,000 advanced missiles made by a rising superpower? The answer is unfolding right before our eyes. Yemen, long portrayed in the global media as weak, fractured, and forgotten, has stunned the world by launching a barrage of 1,000 Chinese-manufactured missiles directly at Israel. And the result, as shocking as it sounds, is devastation so complete that even Israel's renowned military defenses, its Iron Dome, its David Sling, its layers of Western-funded protection crumbled into dust. Israel, for the first time in its modern history, is being spoken of as destroyed without remains. When Yemen launched 1,000 Chinese-made missiles in a single coordinated strike against Israel, the world witnessed more than just a headline. It witnessed the shattering of a historical assumption about military superiority in the Middle East. For decades, Israel has projected an aura of invulnerability fortified by some of the most advanced defense systems in existence, funded and supported by billions of dollars in U.S. military aid. The Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow systems, all have been showcased to the world as proof that Israel could neutralize any aerial threat with precision and speed. But when the skies were suddenly filled with 1,000 missiles, that aura collapsed. No defense system, no matter how advanced, was built to withstand such a massive saturation strike. The very concept of security so deeply tied to Israel's national identity and political standing was put into question in real time. And here lies the first hook. What the world saw was not just a military attack, but the tearing down of an illusion that had shaped decades of regional politics. The scale of the Yemen strike is what makes this moment historic. 1,000 missiles are not simply weapons. They are a message written in fire across the skies of the Middle East. Yemen, a country often described as poor, desperate, and broken, proved that in modern warfare, asymmetry can be turned into advantage. By sheer volume, by overwhelming the radar systems and missile interceptors, Yemen exposed a truth that military strategists have quietly admitted for years. No defense is absolute. Every shield can be broken if the attack is coordinated with enough force, speed, and precision. This is the second hook. Weakness can disguise strength until the moment it is revealed, and then it changes everything. From a geopolitical perspective, the launch represents a rupture in the established order. It demonstrates that even small war-torn nations can wield tools capable of shaking global confidence. For Israel, the shock lies not only in the destruction on the ground, but also in the loss of psychological superiority. For years, Israel's military dominance was not just about missiles and tanks. It was about perception. Neighbors, rivals, and even allies believed in its ability to repel any threat. That belief was worth as much as the weaponry itself. When 1,000 missiles tore through that perception, Israel's power shifted from being unquestioned to being uncertain. And uncertainty is the beginning of vulnerability. This is where the real damage lies. Because once confidence breaks, enemies are emboldened, allies hesitate, and the balance of power tilts. There is also the symbolism of numbers. One missile can be dismissed as an accident, 10 as an act of defiance, 100 as a serious escalation, but 1,000 coordinated, deliberate, and effective transcends the military dimension. It becomes a political statement, a declaration to the world that Yemen is no longer the forgotten battlefield of the Arab world, but a player capable of rewriting the rules of confrontation. The hook here is that Yemen used a quantity to create quality. The mass itself became the weapon that no technology could offset for the wider Middle East. The event carries echoes of past turning points. moments when long-standing power suddenly faltered and new actors rose to prominence. It reminds us of how the fall of the French fleet in World War II or the shock of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam changed not only military strategies, but also the very narratives that guided nations. Yemen's 1,000 missiles will be remembered in the same way as a pivot, a shock that forced the world to rethink the trajectory of power in the region. And yet, perhaps the most compelling aspect is the irony. Yemen, a nation under siege, bombarded and starved by war for nearly a decade, emerged as the very country to deliver a strike that may be remembered as the most decisive in recent Middle Eastern history. That paradox that those once seen as broken can rise to shatter giants is a hook that resonates beyond politics. It is a reminder that no system, no empire, no fortress is immune when the marginalized refuse to remain silent. Israel's security narrative has for decades been one of its strongest assets, a carefully cultivated image of invincibility supported by unmatched defense systems, cutting-edge intelligence, and the unwavering backing of the United States. It was not only about physical protection, it was about psychological dominance. The Iron Dome became more than a missile defense system. It became a symbol of certainty, a reassurance to citizens, allies, and even rivals that no matter what was fired at Israel, the skies would hold. Yet, when Yemen unleashed a barrage of 1,000 Chinese-made missiles, that certainty fractured in plain sight. The system that was marketed to the world as impenetrable buckled under the sheer weight of saturation. And here lies the hook eye. Once an illusion of perfect security is broken, it cannot easily be repaired. The collapse was not only technical, it was reputational. Israel's defense systems had been showcased as the benchmark for modern warfare, purchased by nations around the globe and integrated into the strategic thinking of its military partners. When they failed in the face of overwhelming firepower, the damage extended beyond Israel's borders. Other nations watched closely, and what they saw was the exposure of limits. If a relatively poor nation battered by years of conflict could dismantle Israel's defenses, then the entire narrative of Western-funded military superiority demands reassessment. The hook here is stark. What crumbles in seconds on the battlefield can take decades to rebuild in perception. For Israel, the situation is even more dangerous because its national identity is tied so deeply to its survival narrative. Every election, every military maneuver, every foreign policy choice has leaned heavily on the guarantee that the state is unshakable no matter the odds. The myth of invulnerability was as much a political weapon as a military one. With one Saarlausen missile shattering that myth, the political consequences are profound. Leaders will scramble to explain. Allies will hesitate before offering unconditional support, and adversaries will sense blood in the water. Security, after all, is not only a military condition, but a currency of trust. And when that currency collapses, the entire economy of power shifts. The scale of this collapse resonates on multiple levels. On the domestic front, Israeli citizens who once trusted the shield above their heads are forced to confront fear in ways they had not before. Fear changes politics. It changes society, and it erodes confidence in leadership on the international stage. Nations that once aligned unquestioningly with Israel now have to consider whether that alignment still guarantees stability. Investors, too, are not blind. Markets punish uncertainty, and the ripple effects of shattered defenses spread into energy prices, defense contracts, and strategic partnerships. This is another hook. Wars today are not just fought with weapons, but with confidence. And once confidence is lost, the damage multiplies across sectors. What Yemen exposes not only that Israel's defenses can be overwhelmed, but that Israel's story of being untouchable is fragile. Stories matter in politics. They bind citizens together and deter enemies before battles are even fought. But the story Israel has lived on has now been rewritten by a nation many dismissed as powerless. And when a story collapses, it is not easily restored because every future claim of invulnerability will now be met with skepticism. That skepticism is a weapon in itself, arming Israel's adversaries with belief and emboldening them to test the system again and again. The most profound shift here is psychological. For decades, Israel's adversaries fought uphill battles against the assumption that their efforts were futile, that no matter how many rockets they launched, they would never break through. Today, that psychological barrier has been destroyed. Yemen demonstrated that quantity, persistence, and coordination could do what once seemed impossible. The hook is clear. When fear shifts from the attacker to the defender, the battlefield itself transforms, and so does the future of conflict in the region. China's shadow in this conflict cannot be ignored because every missile that streaked across the sky from Yemen toward Israel carried with it more than explosive power. It carried the unmistakable imprint of Beijing's expanding global influence. These were not missiles made in Yemen factories, forged from local resources, or engineered in isolation. They were Chinese manufactured, designed with the precision of one of the world's fastest growing military industrial complexes. That fact alone transforms the meaning of this strike. It was not only Yemen's defiance, it was a demonstration of China's reach into the geopolitical heart of the Middle East. And here is the hook. The battlefield no longer belongs exclusively to those firing the weapons, but also to the invisible powers supplying them. China has long pursued a strategy of indirect influence, avoiding the overt military entanglements that have drained Western powers in recent decades. Instead, it has built its strength through trade, infrastructure, technology, and carefully crafted partnerships. The Belt and Road Initiative, the expansion of ports, the weaving of economic dependency. These have been the hallmarks of Chinese power projection. But when Chinese-made missiles overwhelm Israel's defenses, the world realizes that Beijing's influence is no longer confined to spread cheats and shipping routes. It now extends into the most sensitive theaters of war. The hook here is simple yet profound. China doesn't have to fire a shot to reshape the balance of power because its industries have already armed those willing to test the old order. For Israel and its Western allies, this is a deeply unsettling revelation. For decades, the Middle East has been a chessboard dominated by American and European arms. The weapons sold, the systems deployed, the training provided, all ensured that U.S. influence remained paramount. Yet now, in a single strike, we see the emergence of a parallel system, an alternative supplier, an alternative partner, an alternative future. The implication is that U.S. dominance in arms and security is no longer exclusive. And once alternatives exist, alliances begin to shift. Governments that once relied only on Washington may now look eastward, calculating where the winds of the future truly blow. The use of Chinese weapons also highlights a critical economic reality. War is never just about strategy. It is also about industry. Every missile fired is not only an act of aggression, but also a form of advertisement. Watching the effectiveness of Chinese weaponry against one of the most heavily defended states on earth is the kind of showcase no arms fair or trade agreement could ever provide for buyers across Asia, Africa, and even Latin America. The message is unmistakable. There is a new supplier whose products can rival and in some cases surpass what the West has offered for decades. That shift has profound implications because arms deals are not simply transactions, they are long term commitments that tie economies, militaries, and political loyalties together. The hook here is that China has just announced itself not only as an economic superpower, but as a military supplier capable of shaking the strongest defenses in the world. For Yemen, using these weapons is more than strategy, it is symbolism. It signals alignment, a declaration that it has chosen to stand with the rising power rather than bow to the old one. And for China, supplying such arms without ever placing a soldier on foreign soil is the perfect demonstration of soft, hard power, the blending of influence through technology, economics, and controlled escalation. The genius lies in deniability. China does not have to be on the battlefield to shape its outcome. Yet, its presence is undeniable in every destroyed site, every failed interceptor, every moment of panic in Israeli skies. What makes this moment historically significant is that it illustrates how global power now operates in layers. Wars are no longer fought simply by nations against nations. The question that now lingers over Washington and Tel Aviv is one that would have seemed unthinkable only a short time ago. Has the era of American guarantees come to an end? For decades, Israel's survival was anchored not only in its own military capabilities, but in the unspoken assurance that the United States stood behind it with unmatched power. Billions of dollars in military aid flowed annually. Advanced weapons systems were transferred without hesitation, and diplomatic cover was provided at every international forum. That guarantee was so strong that it reshaped the geopolitics of the Middle East. Adversaries calculated their moves not only against Israel, but against the weight of American power that would inevitably follow. Yet, when Yemen launched 1,000 missiles and Israel's defenses collapsed, the guarantee looks suddenly fragile, even hollow. And here is the hook. A guarantee that cannot withstand a true test is no guarantee at all. This moment matters because it exposes the gap between promise and reality. The United States has long presented itself as the global protector, the enforcer of order, the ultimate backstop for its allies. But as Chinese weapons rained down on Israel, American support was reduced to words and delayed diplomatic maneuvers. The missiles were not intercepted by U.S. systems in real time. The skies were not cleared by American intervention. And the promise of security did not prevent destruction. That failure is not just tactical, it is symbolic. The entire architecture of U.S. influence in the region rests on the belief that American power is both present and decisive. When that belief is shaken, the ripple effects are enormous. For Israel, this rupture forces a recalibration. Its leaders have always relied on Washington's backing to project confidence to their own citizens and to intimidate their adversaries. But when the missiles fell and the destruction was visible, the reassurance of U.S. aid sounded less like a shield and more like a slogan. The reality is that American guarantees may work against smaller threats, but they falter when confronted with a coordinated large-scale strike that overwhelms even the best defenses. The hook here is clear. The myth of absolute protection has been punctured, and once exposed, it cannot easily be restored. For America's other allies around the world, the lesson is equally unsettling. Nations in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East that depend on U.S. security commitments are now asking themselves whether those promises will hold under real pressure. If Israel, the closest and most heavily supported ally in the region, can suffer such a collapse under America's watch, what confidence can smaller allies truly have? This is not just a question of defense. It is a question of alignment. The global order rests on choices made by states that bet their future on one superpower or another. When the reliability of the U.S. comes into doubt, the space opens for alternatives, whether that means greater self-reliance, regional alliances, or increasingly turning toward China. Economically, the implications are just as severe. The U.S. defense industry thrives on the perception that its products, its systems, and its partnerships are unrivaled. When Yemen's barrage exposes their limits, markets take note. Contracts that once seemed guaranteed may now be renegotiated, and competitors, especially China, gain credibility. This erodes not just military dominance, but also the economic ecosystem that sustains it. The hook is that America's power has always been more than military hardware. It has been the credibility that made its hardware the first choice. Once credibility falters, so does demand, and with it the long-term grip of U.S. influence. At its core, the unraveling of American guarantees represents a shift in psychology. Allies no longer see protection as certain. Adversaries no longer fear retaliation as inevitable, and neutral states begin to hedge their bets. That shift is subtle but decisive because global politics runs on expectations as much as capabilities, and expectations are now changing. The hook here is unsettling. The world may be witnessing the slow but unmistakable end of the American era of unquestioned guarantees, replaced by a landscape where protection is conditional, fragile, and perhaps even obsolete. The immediate destruction caused by Yemen's launch of 1,000 missiles against Israel was visible in the craters, collapsed buildings, and burned out infrastructure. But the deeper impact radiated far beyond the battlefield, shaking the foundations of the global economy, destabilizing trade networks, and rattling investors who measure risk not only in weapons, but in uncertainty. Wars are never contained within borders anymore. They are instantly globalized through energy markets, financial exchanges, and shipping lanes. And here is the hook. A missile that strikes in the Middle East today can just as easily disrupt the price of food in Africa, the stability of oil futures in Europe, and the confidence of investors in Asia tomorrow. The Middle East sits at the crossroads of global energy supply, and Israel's sudden vulnerability sends shock waves into the market. Energy prices, always sensitive to instability, spike the moment news of the Yemen strike spread. Traders know that when Israel is under attack, the entire region is at risk because conflict can disrupt shipping routes in the Red Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Insurance premiums on cargo vessels rise, shipping delays increase, and the cost of energy filters into every sector of the global economy. It is not only about oil, it is about the cascading effect of higher transportation costs, inflationary pressures, and reduced consumer confidence. The hook here is brutal but simple. 1,000 missiles launched in one night can trigger a chain reaction that empties wallets around the world. Financial markets responded in the way they always do when confronted with uncertainty. They panicked. Stock exchanges from Tel Aviv to New York to London saw volatility as investors tried to calculate whether this attack was an isolated event or the beginning of a prolonged destabilization of one of the world's most sensitive regions. Defense contractors saw temporary spikes in valuation, while airlines, energy firms, and tech companies with heavy exposure to Israeli markets experienced immediate losses. Bond yields adjusted to reflect new risk levels, and central banks were forced to watch carefully for spillover effects into global inflation. This shows us another hook. War today is not just measured in destroyed buildings, but in evaporated billions. For regional economies, the consequences are even sharper. Israel is not only a military power, but also a hub of technology, finance, and trade. Disruption there sends ripples through global supply chains, particularly in high-tech industries where Israeli firms play critical roles in semiconductors, cybersecurity, and research. When missile strikes disrupt production or force companies to relocate operations, global tech markets feel the shock. And for neighboring states, the instability threatens tourism, foreign investment, and cross-border trade that many depend on for survival. The irony is stark. A strike intended as a military statement quickly morphs into an economic earthquake whose tremors are felt from boardrooms to grocery stores. Beyond the immediate markets, there is also a longer-term strategic fallout. Investors and governments both understand that stability is the most precious commodity in global trade. When Israel, long considered a stable anchor in a volatile region, suddenly looks exposed, the perception of the Middle East changes. Investors may hesitate to fund infrastructure projects. Shipping companies may reroute vessels through longer, costlier passages, and multinational firms may scale back operations. Once uncertainty becomes embedded in the perception of a region, it reshapes how money flows, often for years. This is another powerful hook. The perception of instability lingers far longer than the smoke from missile strikes. And then there is the psychological economy of fear. Consumers hearing of missile barrages and collapsing defenses respond instinctively by tightening spending, hoarding essentials, and pulling back from risk. That behavior multiplied across millions slows economies, depresses growth, and deepens the cost of conflict in ways less visible, but no less devastating. Politicians and leaders understand this well, which is why they fear not just the missiles, but the headlines, the panic, and the erosion of trust in their ability to maintain order. The Yemen strike, therefore, was not simply a military operation, it was a global economic event. It reminded the world that power is not confined to weapons, but extends into markets, trade routes, and the invisible web of financial confidence that keeps economies moving. The hook is chilling in our interconnected world. War is never local, and every explosion echoes in places far removed from the battlefield. What makes Yemen's strike so extraordinary is not just the destruction it caused, but the symbolism it carried. Because this was more than a military action. It was a declaration of identity, a statement of resistance, and a rewriting of how power is understood in the Middle East. For nearly a decade, Yemen has been portrayed in the global press as the epitome of weakness, a nation besieged, starving, fractured, and hopeless. It was a country that outsiders pitied more than they feared. Yet, when 1,000 missiles tore through Israel's defenses, that perception collapsed. The very state that was meant to be on its knees suddenly stood tall on the world stage. And here lies the hook. There is nothing more powerful than when the world's most underestimated actor turns its scars into strength. This strike was a psychological blow as much as a physical one. Israel, with its sophisticated weaponry and Western backing, was supposed to be beyond reach. The narrative was that small nations like Yemen could resist, but never truly alter the balance. By overwhelming Israel's defenses, Yemen did not just damage infrastructure, it dismantled that myth. It proved that vulnerability exists even in places where the world believed it was impossible. That shift in psychology is monumental because wars are not won only with weapons. They are won in the minds of people, in the confidence of nations, and in the belief of populations about who is strong and who is weak. Once those beliefs are overturned, the battlefield itself is transformed. The symbolism reaches beyond Yemen's borders, across the Arab world and beyond. Populations that once saw Yemen as a victim now see it as a symbol of defiance. For Palestinians, for resistance groups in Lebanon, for marginalized nations everywhere, the message is clear. Even the weakest, when determined and strategic, can pierce the armor of the strongest. That inspiration is as dangerous to Israel and its allies as the missiles themselves because ideas spread faster than weapons. And once people begin to believe in possibility, the dynamics of resistance change forever. The hook here is that one successful act of defiance can fuel countless others without a single missile being launched again. On the international stage, Yemen's strike functions as a lesson in humility for great powers. The US, Europe, and Israel assumed that overwhelming force, advanced technology, and constant surveillance would be enough to suppress Yemen indefinitely. They underestimated the capacity of the oppressed to innovate, to adapt, and to endure. The irony is striking. The very hardships imposed on Yemen through blockades and bombardments forced it to develop strategies that would one day stun the world. In this sense, the attack was not just a military move, but a statement. You cannot permanently bury a people under rubble without risking that the rubble itself will one day rise against you. The symbolic victory also reshapes how Yemen sees itself. For years, its population has endured unimaginable suffering, often feeling invisible to the rest of the world. This moment, however, changes that narrative internally as well as externally. It tells Yemenis that they are not powerless, that their sacrifices and resilience have produced a moment that no one can ignore. National identity, long battered by war, finds new strength in the image of a small, impoverished country shaking the pillars of a regional giant. This transformation of self-perception is perhaps the most enduring result of all, because a population that believes in its strength is far more difficult to subdue than one resigned to its weakness. Even the choice of weapons, Chinese-made missiles, adds to the symbolism. It ties Yemen's act of defiance to the broader shift in global power, linking a nation written off as broken to the rise of a superpower challenging U.S. dominance. The strike becomes not only Yemen's statement, but also a reflection of a larger global transition where the margins of power begin to redefine the center. The true hook is this: Yemen's missiles were not only about destruction, they were about dignity. They announced that even in the ruins, there can be resistance. Even in poverty, there can be power. And even in the forgotten corners of the world, history can be rewritten. What Yemen achieved was to turn victimhood into leverage and invisibility into visibility. And that transformation may prove to be more disruptive to the established order than any crater left on the ground. So I leave you with this: the destruction we are seeing is not only about missiles or cities, it is about narratives whose narrative will dominate the future. Will it be the fading narrative of American dominance and Israeli security guarantees? Or will it be the new narrative, one written in Chinese factories, launched from Yemen soil, and received by a world realizing that power is no longer what it used to be? History, as I remind my students, does not move in straight lines. It moves in ruptures, in shocks, in moments when the impossible suddenly becomes undeniable. Yemen's 1,000 missiles are one of those moments. If we do not learn the lesson about inequality, about arrogance, about the changing tides of global power, then we will be condemned to repeat this cycle only with new actors and even higher stakes. Thank you.